Hi everyone and welcome back. Okay, in this tutorial what we're going to do is we're going to cover the concept of nested loops in JavaScript. So a nested loop is a loop inside of another loop. So far we've seen how we can use a single loop to write out, a piece of code. So a single loop can be used, for example, to iterate over the elements of an array, iterate over elements of an array, count for numbers 1 to 100, check that every number between 1 and some other value is an even or odd number, etc. So we've seen single loops. So you're probably wondering, why would we need to use a nested loop, a loop inside of a loop? Well, a nested loop is very useful if you're trying to work with a grid. So there's various games you can create in JavaScript that will have a grid-like structure. And nested loops work very well with what is known as a two-dimensional array. A two-dimensional array is essentially a grid. So before we start talking about two-dimensional arrays, I want to make you aware of the concept of nested loops. Basically, a loop inside of a loop, and they work very well with two-dimensional arrays or any form of grid. Okay, so nested loops, a loop inside of a loop. The best way for me to show you this is to write one out, and let's see what it does in the console. So we've seen loops before. We have our for keyword, we have our parentheses, and then our curly braces. And there's three conditions that need to go inside of the loop. We need to initialize our counter variable. There's some condition that while it is evaluating to true, the loop will run. And then at the end, we have the final expression, the area at which we either increment or decrement our counter variable. So what I want to do is I want to have the outer loop count from 1 to 5 and the inner loop count from 1 to 10, just so you can see what happens. So I will say let I be equal to 1, and I want to run this loop while I is less than or equal to 5. And after each loop iteration, every time we run this loop, I want to increment I, our counter variable, I++. So the outer loop, okay, that's the outer loop, and inside of it then we're going to put in the inner loop. So all you need to do is just use the for keyword again. I cannot use I because I has already been declared essentially, but what we can do is we can use another symbol to represent this loop, and we will use J. Okay, J comes after I in the alphabet, so it's common convention in JavaScript to use I, J, and K typically for loops. So we'll say let J be equal to, also going to start counting J at 1, and we're going to run J while, force a habit, while J is less than or equal to 10. And then after each loop iteration, we're going to increment our counter variable for J. So how do we use the increment operator with J? It's just J++. Okay? And this is the inner loop, okay? So another way to think about this is essentially I represents the rows and J represents the calls, okay? But you'll see this now when we log this out to the console. Okay, so what I want to do is I just want to log out console.log I, the string, just so you can see what the value of I is. And then I want to log out J, and I want to show you what the actual value of J is. Okay, so we're going to log out I colon the value of I and then J colon. Okay, and what you're going to see is actually quite interesting, because what you're going to realize is that when we start running the outer loop, okay, so when I is equal to 1, I is less than 5, condition value it's true, therefore we enter the loop. So remember the opening and closing curly brace here. What you're going to find is while I is equal to 1, we're going to run the inner loop 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times before we come up and increment I to be 2. So to prove that to you, if I just save and refresh, what you'll see here is, notice how I has a value of 1, but J has gone all the way up from 1 to 10. So while I stays at 1, J goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Then what we do is we increment I to 2, and the inner loop runs an entire 10 times before we increment I up to 3. Okay? So the key point of this is that when you have nested loops, the inner loop is going to completely run, iterate over, while this condition evaluates to true. Then what happens is the loop has completed running, and then we come back up here, increment I, and if this condition evaluates to true, we enter the loop again. Okay? Now, one thing you could do if you wanted is, instead of just logging stuff out to the console, you could actually say document.write if you wanted to write out a star, okay? Or make some sort of triangle. So if we save and refresh, we get the stars written out onto the web page rather than in the console. And what you could do if you wanted is, after each time the inner loop runs, you could use document. You could use document.write to add a line break, i.e. write HTML. So what you could do is you could say document.write and then insert here a line break using BR in JavaScript. Okay, so what we're doing here is we're actually, for the first time in this course, we're getting JavaScript to write some HTML. And notice how it's document.write, okay? So if I save and refresh, what you notice is we're able to get the stars on different lines. So what you should notice is the outer loop runs 5 times and the inner loop runs 10 times. So what happens is we get to the I is 1, and we run the loop 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times. Then after the inner loop is completely ran, we then do the loop again, the outer loop, when I is a value of 2, 3, 4, and 5. And one thing you could do if you wanted is you could actually change this code to make a triangle. Okay, and how you do that is run the inner loop while j is less than or equal to I. And if I save and refresh, let's see what happens. We get this little star structure. Okay, so how does that work? Well, remember, the outer loop keeps track of I. So what happens is we have I at 1 and j at 1. Okay, so I is 1, we enter the inner loop, and how many times do we run the loop? We run the loop while j is less than or equal to I. So I has a value of 1, j has a value of 1, so therefore we enter this loop and we document.write 1 star to the page, which you see here. Okay, then the inner loop stops running and we create a line break. We say document.write break, hence the next time the loops run, we're on the next line. And now what happens is we've come up here, we've used the increment operator, and I now has a value of 2. So while the first time the loop ran we printed out 1 star, we then created a break, now we have 2. I is a value of 2. So then we come in here and we say, okay, j is 1, but now, well, j is 1, I is 2, so we're going to run the loop twice. So we say document.write star, i.e. star star. Then we exit the inner loop and we add a break, okay? Hence, we come down to this loop here, and so on and so on, okay? So guys, that is nested loops inside of JavaScript. Basically, it is a loop inside of a loop, or what people like to joke as loop inception. And if you want to create this triangle-like structure, you can do so by just setting the while condition for the inner loop for j, your counter variable of the inner loop, to be less than or equal to the counter variable of the outer loop. And nested loops are very useful when working with 2D arrays or 2-dimensional arrays. Okay, I just want you to be aware that nested loops exist. I'll see you in the next tutorial.